One, I do infectious diseases, which might not seem like an obvious link, but I kind of did see like sort of disasters. I did see some parallels when I started looking into this. The second is I'm a Katrina person. Our house got 15 feet of water from the curb.
Is that what brought you to Texas?
Yes, that is what brought me to Texas.
Wow.
Yes. So I can I definitely see parallels there.
Historian Shannon Duffy came to this story with more than academic interest, a senior lecturer in early American history at Texas State University. She studies how fear, disease, and perceived threat shape communities under pressure. Having survived Hurricane Katrina, she also recognizes something in Galveston that feels disturbingly familiar, the mix of warning, confidence, disbelief, and delayed realization that so often shapes catastrophe. In this first of 2 episodes on the Galveston hurricane of 1900, still the deadliest natural disaster in American history, we begin with the question at the heart of the storm. How did they fail to understand what was coming?
From prairie winds to courthouse doors, these tales run deep to the Texas core. With Texas tales, there's always more, so come chase the past with Lone Star lore.
Many people have written about the 1900 storm in Galveston, about the night of terror it unleashed on the island and nearby towns, about the nearly 100 orphans all tied together with their caregivers who perished, about how the city, after the storm, created the modern form of city manager and council to govern cities, about how Galveston raised the entire island 2 feet, about how Galveston built a seawall. Those parts of the story have been told and retold. This is the sad, grim side of the story you don't read or hear often. What do you do in 1900 if you're isolated on an island with approximately 10,000 human bodies, mostly entangled in mountains of debris, battered beyond identification, and nearly all nude, a result of the rushing water? The storm literally destroyed the bustling, thriving town of Galveston, leaving little but the island sands and the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Drawing on a book in Project Gutenberg, written by Paul Lester and published by Richard Spillane, editor of the Galveston Tribune, entitled The Great Galveston Disaster. This episode looks at lesser-known parts of the disaster and paints a picture far more complex than you might have first thought. So there is no contest in the Who Owns Texas History question in this episode. We dedicate this episode to all those who lost their lives during and in the aftermath of the storm, and those who survived to tell the tales. They all own this part of Texas history in memory and fact. On September the 7th, 1900, Galveston was the second largest port on the Gulf Coast, home to a population of 38,000 and poised to overtake New Orleans in shipping, commerce, and banking. Known as Queen of the Gulf, or the New York of the Gulf, the city was the up-and-coming star of Texas business. Houston was the little town across the bay. By 1920, Houston had emerged as the shipping giant of the future, and Galveston as a quaint tourist beach town and home to the University of Texas Medical Branch. The storm that hit on the 8th of September had a lot to do with that transformation.
Galveston was not a backwater town caught off guard by history. It was rising, prosperous, and increasingly confident in what it believed itself to be. And that may be the real place to begin, because the story of this storm is not only about wind and water, it is also about certainty.
This is probably peak progressive hubris. We are at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and the scientific method, and, if our very thorough scientific records say that this ship can't sink or this town can't flood, they are literally going to stand there saying that even as the water is lapping around their ankles. Like I said, it is an age that in some ways had more faith in science than we do now. I think 2 world wars really hammered that science is not always all benevolent.
Back then, they didn't name storms, so it is just the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900. It came out of the Caribbean, as so many do, crossed across the Florida Peninsula, and continued to track west, raking along the states bordering the Gulf Coast. An early season cold front was coming down from the northwest, and it inhibited the storm's otherwise normal turn to the right and landfall well east of Galveston. Additionally, in the view of the U.S. Weather Bureau, quote, Galveston was not up to this time considered as within the hurricane belt, unquote. No doubt that changed. The hurricane that hit Galveston had winds that were estimated at 120 miles per hour. That would be a strong Category 3 storm. But America has seen storms that were Cat 4 and Cat 5. Hurricane Andrew that hit the Bahamas, Florida, and Louisiana in 1992 was a Category 5. Hurricane Harvey on the Texas coast in 2017 was a Category 4 at landfall. But the Galveston storm still ranks as the most destructive natural disaster in terms of loss of life in American history. The documented death toll was 6,000 right after the storm. Then the number was raised to 8,000. Most authorities of the storm say the loss of life was closer to 10,000. It was simply impossible to count all the bodies. Entire families were wiped out, with no one left to report their missing relatives. The winds from this storm were survivable by all accounts, but not the ferocious storm surge coming from two directions. Lester wrote, quote, two gigantic forces were at work. The Gulf force drove the waves high up on the beach, and the gale from the northeast pitched the waters, unquote, over the docks and into the city from the bayside. At first, the populace thought it was just another of the storms they were used to having. Quote, men waited about the city laughing at the rise of water for hours, and it was only when they realized the bay was forcing water to meet the tide from the Gulf that they lost their confidence, unquote. Loss of confidence was the understatement of the day. It was probably more akin to a rising panic. It was too late to evacuate the island, and the populace was bound to have realized they could no longer leave.
What makes Galveston so haunting is not simply that a hurricane struck the Texas coast. Storms had done that before. Storms would do it again. What makes this one different is the scale of human loss, and the possibility that the deadliest natural disaster in American history was shaped not only by nature, but by where it struck, what people believed, and how they chose to perceive the danger in front of them.
The hurricane is going to turn. The hurricane never moves this way. It always moves that way. The barrier island is going to protect us. It's not just what they didn't know. It's that they are so utterly confident of what they think they know.
When there's a hurricane that you're watching the radar, everybody in the room seems to have they all become experts all of a sudden about where this thing's going to turn. Look at it, it's not going to hit us.
I can go past that.
Go
if
ahead.
you live in New Orleans, one of the things you could pick up at the drugstore is your little hurricane tracking kit with little Velcro hurricanes that you can move your. It's like a parlor game. Where do you think the hurricane's going to go? And you can have your little markers and you can make your little hurricanes bigger or larger. One of the questions for Katrina is, well, why did some people not evacuate? Well, we had evacuated 2 times before that particular season.
Okay.
So you get to a point where it costs money to evacuate, and so it costs a couple of $1,000s, and that's for the people who can evacuate. And so it's like, okay, yeah, sure, we're just going to stay for this one.
Okay, we'll hunker down,
Yeah.
and then every so often there's going to be a swing and a miss.
No one. They had always predicted Katrina, but nobody actually expected it. What's interesting about Galveston, and obviously, again, they were basing it on their greatest scientific thinking of the time, which just happened to be wrong, is that they were so utterly convinced that the way that the barrier island was set up, that the hurricane couldn't come that way.
Many reports of the event claim that Galveston had no warning about the storm or its size. They did have knowledge of it, but they ignored those warnings. Spillane alludes to that fact in his introduction, quote, the storm of September the 8th did not, as has been supposed, come upon the city without warning. The same storm, less ferocious perhaps, had swept along the South Atlantic coast several days before, unquote. The U.S. Weather Bureau had been warned about the storm as early as September the 3rd by Cuban weather officials who told American meteorologists this one was on a western track and headed for Texas. The American arrogance and disdain toward the Cuban Weather Bureau doomed the warnings. The Cubans had a remarkable record of accuracy for Atlantic storm predictions. But Willis Moore, who headed the U.S. Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C., was so sure of his supremacy in all things weather that by late August he began a systematic cutoff of all communications with Cuban weather stations. By late on the 5th of September, the Cuban weather station in Havana had figured out how big the storm was and where it was going, but they could not notify anyone in America. The U.S. block on Cuban weather communications was complete. Had the weather authorities in America listened to and learned from the Cuban weather specialists, they might have advised at least some of the citizenry of Galveston to leave the island. It wouldn't have saved any of the property damage, but it might have saved some of the human damage. Galvestonians had no idea what was coming at them.
One of the things obviously I was reading some modern stuff, but I also went and read, HathiTrust has some amazing stuff of just collections of newspapers, and there's a lot of accounts that came out right after 1900. Obviously, it captured people's imagination. I happened to be studying something that happened on the other coast at the exact same time, which is when bubonic plague entered San Francisco from Honolulu. And it literally, same exact time, 1900, and there's a lot of similarities, because just like Galveston, San Francisco is a town on the up and coming. You know, they're ready to be this huge.
What year would that have been?
It'd be 1900.
Wow.
And 1900 to about 1906. And the Great White Fleet is coming. It's on the way, you know, there. And so when they find the first cases, it came from Chinatown in Honolulu, and then it came to Chinatown in San Francisco. The city, I mean, they are censoring the newspapers. They are, basically the doctors are literally looking at patients and lying about why they're dying. But they also had this idea in their heads, again, latest scientific thinking, that only rice eaters can get bubonic plague.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea of any of that.
Yes.
So they were bending the news once they got hit with it.
Yes.
They were bending it to say that it was safe.
That only Asians. And so their solution to this was to try to make a wall around Chinatown, basically like barbed wire, to block them in, because only so they wouldn't infect the rest of the town. But then the earthquake hit in 1906, and of course, there goes the barricade. This is the plague that didn't happen. Why? The entire United States did not get bubonic plague. Seems to have to do with the fact that the throats of our fleas are slightly different, because United States, actually North America, never really did have a epidemic of plague. But what was going on, in some ways, what it reminded me of this is, we are scientific, we are new, we are shiny. This disease, aside from being medieval, was by that point associated with Asia. It is something that nasty, dirty people. And when you read these comments about the Cubans, it's sort of the same. It's like these are primitive people with their folklore. And, of course, they aren't going to know what they're doing because we are new and shiny. And so, in San Francisco, it's the same thing, just like they're trying to set up a weather in this time period. They're also trying to set up the beginning of what is going to be the National Health Service. It's running through the Marines, through the Navy. And yes, they are the government agents of the federal government, and they have the latest, and they're not talking to the Chinese community, and they're not talking to the doctors in the Chinese community.
It doesn't seem to matter if we're talking about the weather or the plague. Politics has a way of distorting public judgment. In that sense, we often ignore the right information because it's coming from the wrong people. So the question is not just what Cuba knew in 1900. It's why some expertise is easier to trust than others, and whether that instinct has really disappeared.
I was supposed to go camping on the 4th of July, and I was staying at a friend's house, and we were woken by the rain, and she happens to be a Latin American historian, and she was on Cuba's weather forecasts. And she said, I remember her saying this, they have been dealing with hurricanes as long as that island's been inhabited. No one is better than they are. And I remember even saying, okay, communist Caribbean nation, what do they know? And they predicted the Kerrville flood. I mean, in other words, our weather forecast, this year, we missed the storm that produced the Kerrville flood, and Cuba picked it up.
Oh, my God. This is repeated. It happened
this year. And I mean, they didn't know Kerrville was but they knew there was a bad storm coming, and I ended up calling in and canceling my reservation. I wasn't going to Kerrville, but I didn't want to be on the roads.
Now, why was she on the Cuban?
She is our Latin American historian, and first she could read Spanish fluently, but also she says as long as that island's been inhabited, they've had to worry about hurricanes. They are the very best.
I had no idea that you were going to come and tell me that. That is insane.
So why didn't someone in the Weather Bureau figure all this out? Someone did. His name was Joseph Cline. He was watching the barometer continuing to fall and observing the signs of a major storm. Joseph worked for his brother, Isaac Cline, who was the chief meteorologist for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Galveston. Joseph continued to tell his brother that a major storm was brewing, but Isaac didn't buy it. He hadn't been notified by Washington to even put the storm warning flag up. So how could a major storm be coming? Isaac Cline succumbed to the oldest of stupid reasons. Because Galveston had never been hit by a storm of such major proportions as his brother Joseph was painting, it couldn't be hit by a storm of such major proportions. It wasn't until the 7th that the chief of the Galveston U.S. Weather Bureau raised the storm flag.
One of the historians said, well, of course, Isaac Cline didn't know about the jet stream. And I thought, but Ben Franklin discovered the jet stream, a century earlier. But, we know that Isaac basically lied post, that he said that he was out on the beaches screaming at everybody to get in, that he saved all these people. And, of course, the bureau that he worked for also was massively lying. Oh, yes, we told Galveston, 48 hours ago that a hurricane was coming, which they did not. I know less about Joseph, but I'm not sure I would trust either brother.
Okay.
What I think that Joseph actually believed was that the house was not sound enough to stay in. But by the time you're in the middle of the storm, it's almost 6 of 1, especially when you have children on your hands.
Did Joseph survive it?
Yes.
He survived.
And I don't think he lost anybody in his family.
But Isaac family,
lost his wife.
He lost his wife.
Who was pregnant, so he lost his unborn baby as well.
Right.
And he should have lost his 6-year-old daughter. She actually went under the water, and then he managed to find her.
For Isaac Cline, the storm had now become personal. He was no longer just the chief meteorologist on the island. He was a husband, a father, and a man moving through a disaster that would become both a private tragedy and later a public reckoning. But what was happening around him was larger than any one house or any one family. As the water and wind drove inland from both sides of the island, individual stories of survival were being swallowed by a much bigger force, one that would begin tearing the city apart, block by block.
The power generated by the winds and the waters started the domino-style chain reaction that was the primary cause of the destruction. When the water and wind from the Gulf and the Bay hit the first row of houses and buildings on land, the structures collapsed. They turned into masses of broken furniture, lumber, entire houses, wagons, barns, stores. Everything went down with the first rush of tide and wind. Spillane put it this way, quote, "Houses near the beach began to crumble and collapse, their timbers being picked up by the wind and waves and thrown in a long line of battering rams against the structures," unquote. That first row of debris formed a near-solid mass that then hit the next set of buildings and only increased the size of the immense block of material marching inward toward the center of the city, collecting power and size as it progressed. It became, in essence, to use Spillane's word, an enormous battering ram driven by the unbelievable power of water and wind, and it was taking out everything in its path.
One thing that was interesting, I hadn't thought about the fact that the Great Fire of 1871 in Chicago had been such a big influence on how they deal with disasters. But one thing was that everybody had to put slate tiles on their roof. And also Galveston had had previous fires. And one of the details that I remember reading was that the veterans, the Civil War veterans, thought it was like Antietam, because once those hurricane force winds got a hold of all those tiles, they were cutting off arms, legs, they were decapitating people, they were killing horses.
There is a bitter irony in that detail. Societies do learn from disaster. They study past destruction, change building practices, and try to prevent the last catastrophe from happening again. But history does not always repeat in the same form. Sometimes the lesson you carry forward protects against one kind of danger while leaving you exposed to another. And that points back to the deeper problem at the center of this story. Trying to safeguard against disaster is noble, but believing you have mastered it is foolish.
Today, we know we cannot predict where the hurricane is going. I mean, we know it. They'll make all kinds of little pictures on the map, but at the end of the day, they know that they are really random. And I think that's something that we have learned that Isaac's generation seems like they didn't know. They had gotten to a point where they thought faith in science and rationality, masculine rationality as they see it. In other words, one of the reasons they don't like the Cubans is, the Cubans are overly emotional. They're seeing hurricanes everywhere. Women and children and non-whites are emotional and irrational. But it's also this is the age of scientific management, top down. We don't want to have local autonomy. We want to have efficient management. That was one of their favorite phrases. These are the people who gave us city managers, and they basically modern bureaucracy.
By the time the storm fully arrived, the failure was no longer theoretical. It was physical, human, irreversible. But the hurricane did not end when the winds began to ease. In part 2, we follow the story into its aftermath, into the bodies left in the wreckage, the impossible task of disposing of the dead, the rumors and racial violence that followed, and the deeper question of what disaster reveals about a society once the water begins to recede. As always, our thanks to Joleene Maddox Snider for her writing and research, and to Shannon Duffy for helping us deepen the story and widen the lens through which we see it. And to all of you listening, thank you for spending time with us. If there is a story, question, or Texas history topic you'd like us to explore, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, this is Lone Star Lore.
From prairie winds to courthouse doors, these tales run deep to the Texas core. With Texas tales, there's always more. So come chase the past with Lone Star Lore.